Thank you, Christine, and thanks for the brilliant presentations and also the interest on behalf of our audience. So currently at the Slido, we have 19 questions, and I just would like to encourage all of you in the audience to check in the Slido link and look through the questions, rate them according to your interest, or add your own questions. And I would also like to invite Sven, Jennifer, and Bettina to switch on your cameras, because you are all panel members for this discussion. Okay, so we are all here now. Thanks a lot. And so basically the idea is that I just go through the questions from Slido, and I will continuously looking your pictures on my screen, and wherever I see that you are raising your hand, either virtually or like, your real hand, then I will just give you the word. And this way we hope that kind of a natural dialogue will come out from the questions. Right, so I'm starting with this one. How are administrative controls carried out, and how are cuts and sanctions accounted for if individuals haven't complied with the requirements? And I think that this question also reinforces some of the inputs to the Padlet, where sanctions or risks were mentioned. Who would like to first reply to this? Lisa.
Yeah, hi. So this is actually something that I didn't explain yet. For example, in the coordinator of the collective in the South, I'm speaking on behalf of what I've heard from him, because I don't work in a collective, I work in the national office, but he says that in this system that we have, there's more flexibility, more time to check in a kind of educational way when things are going wrong. So to make sure that in time, farmer is informed that it's not going great, maybe we have to make some changes, and this is how you do the changes. In order to avoid having to throw them out of the scheme. So that's something that I like to highlight, because it's more of an educational approach. But of course, we have protocols for making sure that what is under contract is also actually happening. And maybe Henk would like to say something about that.
Yeah. And which way do you want me to go, Lisa? What do you...
Maybe you could say something about how. I'm not sure how to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mentioned about trust and control. What the collectives did in the Netherlands is they asked state, and state asked EU in the first period do more checks. When we do more checks in the beginning, you can show that the system really works and it's trustworthy. So in the end, later on, we can have less checks. Do not check on farm level, individual level, but check on the 40 collective level. So when the collectives do their own checks and balances, state or EU only has to control if the collectives are working accordingly what they say they are doing. And when that is checked and it's okay, proven, then all the individual farmers should be fine and you don't have to check them. That makes it much more easy to control, because you only have 40 contracts to check and not 11,000 individual farmers, which is a hassle to do. But on individual farmer level, you know your farmers, you know who is doing what and why he's doing, and when he's doing something wrong, you can talk with him about that, and you can give him individual penalties, and he will be spoken to about that by the collective, but also by his individual neighbors, because to say it very roughly, when the shit hits the fan and you have really a problem with EU, all the farmers have to pitch in. So when there's a problem, everyone gets a penalty because it's a group, collective contract. So all the individual farmers are always all willing to do it for themselves, all right, but also doing it all right for their individual neighbors, the social cohesion. And not that we, by that, have all individual police officers running around being farmers, checking their neighbors if they are doing everything right. But you get a little bit of social pressure not to cut their grass on the 12th of June if the contract says the 15th of June, just because it's going to rain. Now, all the farmers have to wait to 15th June, and they will do that because their neighbor will say, hey, it's 12th, the 12th. That's not correct. And when you're doing that, you can get a penalty, but it also works towards me. So I think the administration control should be limited to only the collective. Does that answer your question, Lisa?
Yeah, I think so. We should probably hand over to one of the others.
Yes, any further comments on this, Sven, Jennifer, or Bettina?
I agree, but in our case, the controls, they are just done like in all other EU member states, like because we work with individual contracts. But what we add on this is the same as Henk said. You have this social control between the farmers because they know it's in the advantage for all of them that they build a good image. And an extra element is that we do follow up also of we assist the farmers who do management work for the others. So these farmers, they are more trained in this kind of jobs and they can do it better. So the error rates will also be lower because of this.
Thanks, Sven. Bettina.
I have no answer, but maybe I would like to go in this direction in our discussion. How big can be a group so that this kind of collective approach can really work on the ground? So I really like this idea, and it fits also in a whole branch of literature, how to really build trust on the one hand and also have this yes, common responsibilities, but I would like to have some kind of experiences because I could imagine that's important for many different countries when they want to implement this collectives. So how to, we heard about, or we know that you have the subgroups. So what's your idea about this group? How big should it be?
Thanks. Henk, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, regarding the size, from the perspective of a group of farmer collective, you need a turnover of 1.5 million at least to be big enough to have a bureau and set up everything. So I think that is one restriction. The second restriction is mainly in the landscape and natural borders. Is there a highway? Is there a canal? Is there a valley? Because is there is that a peat soil? Is it a sandy soil, a clay soil? For example, in the north of Groningen, in the case study also, there are three parts. One is hedgerow, tree-rich, sandy soil. The other one is large, broad-acre clay, and there is also peat where they grow a lot of starch potato. The mentality of those areas are different, so they have different groups. For me, it's about approximately an hour drive from the north to the south of that collective. But within that area, there are social structures on the clay soil, on the sandy soil, and of course they mingle together. But that's from history. There's social structures. So you have to look at the natural boundaries and what is natural in that environment, how big it can be, and how strong those ties are. I can totally imagine that it's totally different in other parts of the EU. Where it can be larger or especially smaller, but also the areas that you can service with your agricultural measurements in the field are restricted. You cannot coordinate 15,000 hectares in one plot with a million. You have certain plots where you do certain things where the ecological gains are best. So here is 1,000 hectares where we do this, and there's 2,000 hectares where we do that, and then there's a white area where you do nothing, and then there's that is from the thinking that sources are limited, especially money. If that's not the case anymore, you have a different ball game. But I think in most countries, the money will be limited.
Sven, go ahead.
In our cases, the groups are quite small if you compare it to the Netherlands. It's like we work more on a municipal or level, or some municipalities next to each other, because we found it from the beginning important that the farmers, they knew each other. So it's about 15, 20, 25 farmers, more or less, in the groups. Maybe it can be bigger over time as we grow and expand. That's the situation like it works now. There are no separate, these farm groups are not separate legal entities. That's a bit the difference with the collectives in Netherlands. So we as an umbrella organization of the 34 collectives are the legal entity for them. So if they need to make a contract or something with some agency, we can act for them as well. So, yeah. Maybe you can compare it also with the subgroups in the Netherlands.
Thanks, Sven. Jennifer.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different issues here. On the group size, I would tend to say that the facilitation fund groups are fairly similar to the group sizes that Sven has mentioned. You're looking at around 25, 30 farmers usually. On the sort of success and the scale of the sizes, I think that really varies depending on who you're talking to, as well as the type of scheme or initiative you're thinking about. As Henk said, there's a couple of really important factors, like the natural boundaries have tended to be, but not always, the factors which restrict or determine the groups in facilitation fund as collective approaches in the UK. But this issue of how strong the sort of social ties are has been a real determining factor in the success or less successful sort of group cohesion and how well they work together. Over 3 or 5 years, it can take that long to build the trust before sort of real on the ground or facilitated, coordinated environmental land management sort of starts to happen. But that's the full length of the contract with the facilitation fund groups. It's probably quite interesting to compare that to sort of the other kind of collective approaches in the UK, which would be the upland commons and how they work together. So the Lake District National Park has run a pilot looking at sort of catchment scale land management plans involving multiple farmers. So looking at sort of the river scale, looking at one area that way, but the farmers in those areas have very strong ties to farmers in multiple valleys. So those farmers actually consider their collective or their scale the entire Lake District, which is a huge common area, but because they have such strong cultural ties, that but again, as Henk was saying, what you can actually deliver at that scale is very limited. So there are institutional and social barriers that sit alongside these natural boundaries that have to be considered quite carefully in each different area, I think.
Thanks a lot. I'd like now to jump to another question, which was already mentioned by Christina, and also raised in the Padlets. So there is a question in the Slido. How can you build trust among farmers where there is no previous experience or a more individualistic culture? Or maybe I'm just coming up here with my Hungarian origins, like a post-socialist country where collective action might either have a bad connotation. So how to move forward from these less favorable social situations towards collective action?
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
So yeah, I can imagine if there's some bad experience with collaboration, it's important to make clear what you mean with this collaboration between the farmers. Sometimes we say we don't mean that you have to live together. It's, you are already here on this meeting as a group of farmers. When we meet again, it will be a bit the same. So it's not so much more in times. Of course, it's important the role of the facilitator there, especially if you see, and sometimes we have it also that there are conflicts between farmers because of some lands they were hoping for. That they trust us at least, and that we can facilitate this, and also that we carefully look of who can be president of this group and the secretary, that these are people who are trusted by the other farms. We also start from very locally. The farmers, they in the farmer union, they already have this kind of farmer guilds where we brought the story. So if you have this kind of structures already existing, it's useful to use them. Also, we had opportunity that we could work from through the farmer union, and the farmer union is trusted by the farmers. So that's an extra win we had.
Thank you. Any other comment on this? Henk, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the key word is perspective. I think you can. It has to be better than a place where you were. Why did people immigrate to the Americas or Australia 100 years ago? Because the situation where they're in wasn't the best, and they had perspective that it could be better. So as long as there is perspective and maybe as much as possible guarantees, you can challenge people to do the next step.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, I think also being voluntary is a key word. Yeah, they don't need to feel like something is put on them, but they are being asked, and they can say yes or no, and they can say how much they want to be involved and how much they don't.
Thank you, Jennifer. What about from UK?
Yeah, I think that this in this idea of building trust, there's both building trust between the farmers, which, as I mentioned previously, can take time, but also building trust between the farmers and the coordinators and the organizations who are going to be administering or implementing these sort of contracts. And again, this can take a really long time and really involves committing to sustained dialogue between the farmers and the coordinators, open, approachable individuals as well. I think seeing the same familiar faces is so important, and some organizations do this really well, others for many reasons, not necessarily the fault of the organization certainly, but because of like reduced funding to Natural England, for example, meaning they have sort of less officers to spread across wide areas, can be a really important issue. But the more that organizations are supported to provide one familiar face or a few familiar faces for farmers to work with, that seems to be really, really crucial.
Thank you. If no more reactions, then I would go to the next question, which is slightly related, I think. It was addressed to Sven, but I think it can be generalized. So the original question sounds like, Sven, do you feel that the farmers are now able to organize themselves from the bottom up, or do they still need coaching? And if we consider this as a more general question, then I would frame it like, do you think that through the collective contracts, farmers are also empowered and getting more into control and taking more their own initiatives? So can this be considered as like really building capacities and empowering them?
I can start with. Now we see a lot of differences between the groups. It depends on really on people, and it's true we see this empowerment happening in the farmer groups. But often the more empowered they are, the more they ask guidance from us as well, because they want to do more and they want to know more and they want advice and help, and because it's not that easy always also for us to know how to create synergies between farming and nature. We're also still learning and experimenting on this. Also, you have the complexity of the legislation, of the ways of funding, of all of this, and also bringing together or exchanging between groups. These are aspects we can help them, and it really depends. But most of the in many groups, it won't that. I think if there wouldn't be a facilitator at this moment, it would be a big problem, of course, because they want to collaborate, but they don't have a lot of time to organize all of this.
Thanks, Sven. Any other experiences from the UK or the Netherlands? Jennifer?
Thanks, Esther. Yeah, I think the UK experience is fairly similar to what Sven has said. The collective contracts for farmers empowered, I think the ones that start from the bottom up, so the facilitation fund groups that are initiated by the farmers who want to access this funding for their facilitator, are certainly some of the more successful groups. But they're not always sort of set up from the bottom up. Some are initiated by other, like the NGOs who want to help the farmers facilitate the group. So there's an agenda setting issue there. But I think there's certainly opportunity and capacity for these collective approaches to be more empowering in the UK. Like as I mentioned in the presentation, the more the collective approaches are embedded into the sort of mainstream schemes, the more likely it is that they'll feel empowered to be with knowledge to kind of work together in these areas. So I think it needs to be more part of the schemes in the UK currently. So similar to work towards what Sven has, I think.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, I definitely think that the structure of the collective contract can help create more ownership and empowerment. Is what I've heard from collectives all over the country, like specifically also Henk's collective Aanog in Groningen. They really say to farmers like, okay, you want to have a contract, go organize yourself, and the farmers do, like they go and they make a plan, and then it's theirs. You know, it's very different, and I think it also ties into the degree of it being voluntary. That creates more motivation, and I really liked Sven's answer that the more motivated or organized they become, that they also are asking for more, because it's really a co-learning experience, and I think it's really good to see it that way. I also think it's really good to in the future, I think that's where we're moving towards, to tie that together with policy. Like we also want to learn together with the policymakers in the area, because we have to do it together, you know. So that's what we're trying to. Sometimes you see an opposition like us versus them, but we all need to move toward a more healthy landscape, and we need farmers to help us to do that, so we can yeah, hopefully come towards let's do it together attitude as we learn.
Thanks. And indeed, I think that all your replies are very strong in the sense that if we consider this collective approach really like an option, then we should also reconsider how we understand knowledge exchange and how much co-creation we include in setting up these schemes. If there is no more reaction right now to this aspect, then I would jump to another question, a little bit a different direction. This is about the effectiveness of the collective approach for conservation, so for biodiversity or the supply of ecosystem services. So has there been research about the effectiveness? Is there any numbers supporting that these schemes are more effective than the individual contracts?
So Bettina?
Yes, so as I know, there is little literature and empirical work on these, but of course that's because these are new approaches. And in general, I would say from the research point of view, there's really a lack between what we would call good governance and ecological effectiveness. So we definitely have to find also from the research design, and also when we implement such kind of new approaches in the landscape, we have to really develop in parallel the right monitoring or research approach to really get more insights into the relation between different also governance approaches and stakeholder involvement and things like that. So I would say there are evidence, but really hard facts making really a strong link between both. I would say we don't have so much data on that at the moment. And everybody really asks for these, of course, because if you want to implement new instruments and approaches, it would be the best if you can really make this strong link. On the other hand, I would say we know really a lot about how important it is to really approach the landscape scale to be effective, environmentally effective. So based on BORS, I would say it's definitely a relation, but we have to really try to implement more adaptive research on this issue, I would say.
Thanks, Bettina. Sven, the word is yours.
Yeah, I agree with what Bettina says. We also feel there is a more need for this kind of research on the monitoring of effectiveness of measures and so on. We are looking already for a long time for funding, but it's not so easy to get it. We do it in some projects. We are in an Interreg project, Partridge, about farmland birds, and there we have some demo sites together with control sites, and they are following up the insects and the birds. But it takes some time, of course. In our demo sites, we did the best we could do together with the farmers in the collective, a high rate of measures, but it takes some time for you build up this biodiversity. So over the project is still running. Over some years, we will know the effects, but it seems promising. In other projects, we are like for the water conservation. We also put divers in the ditches where we every half an hour we know what's the level of water in the field, and then we see a big effect of these dams we put there in the ditches. They keep the water much longer in the field, especially with the effects of flooding. It reduces the speed of the flooding for 1 day, 2 days, which is important. Also in other projects like Fabulous Farmers, where we're doing experiments and monitoring the measures. But we encourage if there would be like projects more on monitoring of this.
Thanks, Sven. And I think that it's also important what you mentioned, that for different targets, like whether the scheme is focused on biodiversity or on water management, water quality, or on climate change mitigation, it might also complicate how results can be monitored and assessed. And I think it was also mentioned by Henk in his presentation previously. Any further thoughts on that? Yes, Jennifer, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Sven and Bettina that more research needs to be done onto the effectiveness of sort of collective approaches for natural capital. In the UK, obviously, I did sort of indicate that the facilitation fund groups, their perceived impact has been quite small so far, because the sort of added benefit that they were seen to show was really coming from the sort of individual agreements that the farmers then had, the individual countryside stewardship agreements that farmers had, which sat alongside their facilitation fund participation. However, in the phase 3 report that Natural England completed in 2020, there had been an attempt to evaluate and monitor these benefits of the facilitation fund across all of the groups, but they had real issues with data collection and availability. So it's not that they didn't try to do this research; it's that they couldn't get the access to the data that they needed, and so in the end went for this kind of case study approach of just 5 out of nearly 100 facilitation fund groups. So if there was more data available to them, I think that we might have had something to show for that. But so they are commencing the phase 4 evaluations quite soon, I think. But I don't know if that will necessarily focus on the natural capital benefits in the same way. But yeah, so data collection and data availability is a key issue in doing this research, I think.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. Any further reactions?
Yeah, in our case, we're also very happy to have more research on this. We're also very glad that in the Contracts 2.0, for example, Nicolas was investigating this, because we get the question all the time, and we really want to say that it is ecologically effective, you know. So yes, we encourage it.
Thanks. And then the word will stay with you, Lisa and Henk, because the next question was directly asked from you. Okay, so Henk, you can go ahead now.
Yeah, that is the pillar 2 discussion, you mean, Esther? Yeah. Well, environmental schemes are paid for in the Netherlands through pillar 2. Which you apply within a collective. There's pillar 1 payments, which is the flat rate for all the farmers. And the question is, how do farmers feel about a deduction of pillar 1 for making the payments higher in pillar 2? That totally depends on what perspective do you have. First of all, as a farmer, I always encourage free money. So it's great for me if the pillar 1 payment gives me more money. So that's easy. As soon as you see it as a right and people take something away from it, that's not fun. So when they would take it away from me as a farmer and from pillar 1 to pillar 2, I'm not pro for that. But if you look in the total picture, in the past, the highest payments in pillar 1 were the Netherlands and Malta. So if you have a world conquering nation as Malta next to you in the discussion in the EU, you know where the discussion will end. In the end of the road, lower payments in pillar 1 and higher payments in pillar 2. So in general, then me as a farmer on long-term decision making will say, well, then make sure that the payments in pillar 2 are ecological responsible, are not income forgone, but as a social service. Then I can work with it. A fear of the general population, so to say, of farmers would be, yeah, first they pay you money, and then later on it's cross compliance. So a general fear to do that. But then we come back to the point we spoke about earlier. That's the trust. Do you trust your states? Do you trust EU? Yeah, that cannot something I cannot decide for individual farmers. As the umbrella organization Boeren Natuur, we do not mix in that discussion. We only look at what money is in Pillar 2. We can say what we can do with that. We can say when we have more money, what we can do with that. We are not discussing about taking away where the money is coming from. If that's coming from healthcare, or if that's coming from immigration, if that's coming from Pillar 1 from the farmers, or individual states, province doesn't mind to me. We can say what we can do for that money. That's not our job to do that lobby. So it's very much about what perspective do you look at taking away the money, but at the same time, when you take something away, bring perspective on the long term to earn that money back and get into the farmyard. I think that's the key.
Thanks, Henk. Any other follow-up on that? Cool. If not, then we can jump to the next question, also addressed to Lisa, but I think this is a general question which might be interesting to all of the panelists. So what do you think, whether this collective approach is simply transferring the administrative costs from the government to the collectives or the farmers or not? And now I stop here and look at you who would like to start first.
I can start. I think there's a couple of, like a lot of questions actually about administrative costs in the chat. And I think we already discussed quite a bit of them, Henk did for us in the presentation. So to go back to transferring it, I mean, I think it's split because now we have a control that's quicker and easier, I think, at the collective level, and then the individual is being controlled by the collective. So I think that way it's not just a copy from the administration costs. But maybe Henk, would you like to add a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think it's totally different. What I mentioned before is when they're in the pilot project we had before in the step up to this system, we did a trial with farmers and they made field margins in their field. And we said all do, for example, 1 hectare. And then we do a GPS check. How much would there be? 99% of farmers, so to say, 95%, all had more. And the ones that had less, had just a little bit less, maybe a meter or a few meters here. And the first thing they said, oh, of course, when I have 2 little square meters, can I do next year a bit more? And then it's fine. And then we said in the test period, oh, that's great, done deal. If it would be a discussion with the state government, you would have a lawyer sending a letter, it's too small, the farmer would be angry and send a letter back. Of course, you have stupid teledetection systems, come back and show it here, then someone from the state comes, measures everything up. All those things you don't have. So we can do things easier in that pilot program. A lot of those things have been implemented in the system. There's still some things on our wish list. But if you give flexibility about that, maybe it could be a framework, a contract. In 6 years, you have an average of 1 hectare a year, and maybe 1 year you would have 2 hectares, and 1 year no, and things like that. It's not in the system right now, but those kinds of flexibility it makes life easier. In general, in the end of the road, it's about ecological effects you bring, and not if that meter is in that exact spot in that year. It can be also 5 meters to the right, things like that make it difficult. And the costs, it's not just shoved off to the collectives. It's a totally different approach. But most of the costs we make, those overhead, a substantial part is stamping the forms for the government. So if there's less red tape, the cost will go down. But when we need more trust, and to get more trust, we asked EU to do more control now. So in the long run, we get those trust set.
Thanks, Henk. Really interesting to hear that taking decisions locally, doing control locally, and increasing trust can really contribute to a decrease in transaction costs. Bettina.
Just one comment on this. I think we always talk about the trust between farmers, but I really have learned during this project, it's really important that we build trust between the administration or the government and the collectives as really an important point, and we should really try to summarize experiences on these, how to really build on these. I know it depends on social context and all this kind of stuff, but I think we should improve also that kind of exchange, how to go forward there. Yeah, thank you, Henk.
Sven.
Yeah, it's a sensitive issue, of course, because, like Henk says, there is a risk for, if you go the Dutch way, that they lose their jobs. So of course there's a bit of a conflict of interest, and you have to find a way that you can go together or find win-wins. But also, it's our government agency is also a bit afraid if we would go more to the Dutch system because of this. But it's not only about, because the question about was about reducing costs and so on. I'm not sure if it will always reduce costs, but it will increase your impact. So the effectiveness will be higher. Because you have more motivated farmers, they are more committed on the long term, they're willing to do it good, to approve it, and that beside a more coordinated approach. It's also about a combination.
Thanks, Sven. Any reflection from you, Jennifer?
I think with the regards to the facilitation fund, we're kind of less well placed to discuss these issues. So I wouldn't want to comment on something I wasn't sure on.
All right, sure. Henk, you raised your hand and unraised it.
I wanted to look in the chat.
Okay. All right. One thing I would just bring up here, which was like a question below in the rank, but also related to the cost. So someone asked whether this decrease in cost can be also a result of better IT infrastructure if we allocate work at the local level. Big silence, so perhaps not.
Yeah, I don't think there is research at this moment, but in general, what I mentioned before, the Netherlands-wide, there was a certain amount of money, and they changed it into this system, which reduced the operating costs by still giving the same amount of money to the farmers. On state level, they reduced costs because 40% was bureaucracy. Now, so to say, it's 20% of costs for the collectives. So they saved roughly 20% in total costs. But on farm level, the hectares stayed the same. So it is a cost in cost, but it didn't affect the hectares on farm level.
Thanks, clear. There is one question which is, I think, perhaps already answered, but I just put it here for transparency. So someone asked, is the income for farmers reduced by the collective approach or not? So I think that we so far concluded a no, but I just open it up if there is any further comments on this.
That's sort of what I meant about what I just answered. That doesn't mean individual farmers. If an individual farmer is in a certain spot where a bird decided not to nest anymore and fly away to his neighbor, or the neighbor on the other side of the valley, then it will mean for him no income from Pillar 2 agriculture and nature schemes, because as we say here in the north, the money will follow the bird. So that doesn't mean that you have fixed rights because you're, like it was in Pillar 1, my grandfather had a farm, my father had a farm, that's why I was entitled to Pillar 1 payments. That doesn't work in Pillar 2. The money goes where it's ecologically spent best.
Thanks, Henk. Lisa.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's also another question in the chat that I really liked. I wanted to tie it in because this person asked, how do collectives ensure targeted delivery of environmental priorities? And they have the pressure for an even distribution of payments. But I don't think that's the case. I think that's what Henk said. Like, I think they try to put the money where it's best spent, and maybe, I don't know, Henk, you want to say another thing about it, because it's not from my personal experience, but you have it. So I don't think that's an issue, so I thought I would tie that in right away.
Okay, for example, the only thing I can mention on that is, well, when that's the case, an individual farmer who has been used to a payment of late 25,000 euros a year for birdland strips isn't happy about it when you tell him it's not going to land on his land anymore and he's not going to receive that payment, which is a stable factor in farmers' income year after year after year. But within the discussion, he will understand that for the total system to keep running, it is best that those conditions in the field somewhere else are better and the birds go there. On the long run, it will enhance and stabilize that the system is still there. When the strips will stay on his farm, he will maybe have another 6 years of payments, but then data will be collected and an evaluation will say the system doesn't work, it doesn't contribute, birds go down in numbers, not effective, etc., etc. So we go away. He is challenged to do maybe a situation on his farm better or different or in another way. So the conditions are in his area in such a way that in the future, the payments will come back for things he will do. So he's challenged, so to say. Not saying that he's happy with a conversation like that, but that says something, I think, about the effectiveness.
Thank you. Jennifer, you raised your hand before.
Yeah, I just think, so in terms of the income for farmers with collective approaches with the facilitation fund, the farmer doesn't sort of see any of that money because the fund directly only funds the facilitator, but his capacity to earn more is increased in theory through his involvement in the facilitation fund because it adds points to his other countryside stewardship applications, for example, and also there's increased knowledge and awareness that they gain. So it's not a material addition necessarily there, but they certainly don't lose anything financially from involvement in the facilitation fund as a collective approach. The other example in the UK would be the higher level or higher tier stewardship schemes, which can take place on the commons. And that, again, it can only be an addition to his income because the farmer cannot undertake an individual agreement on that common land, even though he can on his sort of private land. But all active graziers have to agree to adhere to that agreement. So one farmer could potentially withhold their ability to undertake that agreement, but there's no sort of reduction per se.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sven, go ahead.
In our cases in Flanders, there's also not a reduction in the financing of the farms. We don't ask them to pay first. We look for other fundings to do the facilitation work. But for them, it can be a decrease in costs and time they spend because they are doing the management more efficiently. If you have a flower strip like behind me of some kilometers and you have several farmers next to each other, and they all have to do their own plots, the sowing and the mowing, then it takes a lot of time for them. But if one farmer does it for the others, then it's only work for one farmer, and the others they don't need to spend this time on it. Of course, they pay part of it to the farmer who does it, but like I showed in the examples, also if you can then look also for more efficient machinery to do the work faster and better, then also you can even reduce some costs by working collectively.
Thanks, Sven. Looking at the time, I think we have like time for 2 more questions. So I spare a more general one to the end. And I would like to pick another one now, which I think was addressed to Lisa. Yes, so someone said, Lisa, you said farmers don't like most result-based contracts payments. I agree with that. Do you try to change this in the Netherlands? And maybe this can be framed again a little bit more general. So how do you see whether the collective contracts can include result-based elements or not? So what is the relationship between these two, in your opinion?
Thank you. Yeah. So I was a little confused because I don't think that was part of my presentation, but it is true that in the case studies, the farmers gave more of a preference to measure-based payments rather than results-based, because their fear is there's other things that influence the results. What if it's a very dry year and I don't get the results that I want, even though I put in the work and I don't get paid? That's kind of what they're afraid of. On the other hand, we have been talking, and Henk has also mentioned it a couple of times, that they would like to be seen as giving a service rather than not producing something, because that's the idea that they get, because often with nature it's like, don't put manure on your grassland, don't do this, don't do that. So they feel that feels restrictive, and being a producer of an environmental good is much more positive, and a result-based approach would fit that. So it's happening, I think. They want, like, I feel like sometimes people would like to have both. But we are definitely moving towards more result-based rewarding. Also in the Netherlands, in the CAP, we're seeing developments that this actually from the first pillar, the money is also going to be more based on more input, more effort, more money. So I don't know that in my organization or like nationwide, we are trying to encourage people to look at this differently. I feel like it's more of a movement that's coming from them, that they are like, hey, this is strange. Like, we're being asked to do something for society, and we would like to, have the reward fit that effort. So that would be my answer.
May I jump in there because our time is running out? And I just wanted to answer one question addressed directly to me, and which is important because it's not so true what's written there. There's written that the German administration doesn't like the collaborative implementation. And what does the DBV thinks about that? I think when Henk said that, he referred to a talk he had many years ago. It was like 5 years ago or something, and that was not really. It didn't really mean that this person didn't like the approach of the approach, and many people in Germany like the approach. Also, the administration, the policymakers. It's just a concern that a lot of people might think that their jobs are in danger when the administration drastically reduces their efforts, and it goes more to the collectives. And I think we have to find a way to deal with this. And I don't think that anytime soon in Germany we will implement the collaborative approach exclusively nationwide. I don't think that's going to happen. We have a completely different structure of governance and all this. But what will happen, and it is happening actually, gradually, we have heard that in Sachsen-Anhalt or in Brandenburg, they also will introduce this approach in the coming funding period from 2023 on as an option, not as an exclusively exclusive program, because we have other issues in Germany. Where would we put the the reward or the compensation for organic farming, for instance, which is now in a second pillar and all this. So but I think it's a good step into the right direction, and we will do that gradually. Not in all Bundesländern, not everywhere, but more and more. So just to clarify that. But we are kind of at the end of our program, so to say, and we wanted to share the word cloud because Lisa and Henk, you wanted to ask the audience about what they think should be the focus of collective schemes, and Edward will now share the results of the word cloud. So we have a look at that. Right, as we can see, biodiversity is right up there, but water quality is pretty close. It's the second best, not second best, but it's also important. And I think that makes sense because water bodies also tend to not really, restricted to borders or whatever, farm lines. So that makes sense, but there's a lot of other stuff which we can look into. Henk and Lisa, do you want to reply to this?
Yeah, it's. I feel like we share the opinion. I mean, obviously, in the Netherlands, water management is very important because we have a lot of it. And it's also related to biodiversity. And I think, I mean, that's what all the goals that are here, they all tie in together. So that's kind of the benefit that we saw to tackle all of them. And because we all share land, a collective approach would be good for that. So I'm happy to see that people see that it could be applicable for many things.
Right. then I would maybe slowly stop the discussion and all right, I wanted to give you some reading material actually for the ones who don't have it yet. It's a very interesting evaluation report of the Wageningen University commissioned by the Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality, food quality, not food quality, in the Netherlands. And there's a rich pool of advices and recommendations on how implement an effective collective scheme and also avoiding some rookie mistakes, as Henk already rightfully pointed out. Then I would like to thank all of the panelists for their valuable time and advices, all of the presenters we heard today, for sharing their experiences and findings. And I hope you have some now a little bit more of a toolkit for implementing or at least put forward this promising approach in your context. We recorded all the presentations and we will make them available through our channels, may it be our website or the YouTube channel, which is a lot of stuff already on there. You can check it out. And the whole team wants to thank you, the audience, also for participating so actively, asking all the right questions to illuminate this topic a bit more. Let's stay in contact. Let's stay in dialogue. You can reach us, and so on this note, I wish you all a good weekend and stay healthy and stay curious.